Happy Wednesday! You're listening to Mama Murdered a Podcast. I'm your host, AB.
And this week on Mama Murdered a Podcast, we're covering a seriously wild and probably controversial case. The case of Hannah Up. Hannah has been reported missing 3 different times. She's had entire cities of people, along with family and friends, all out searching for her, only for her to return or be found in a confused state with no memory at all of the days that she'd been missing for. This case is a wild one, so without further ado, let's get it. Hannah Up was born to her mom Barbara Bellis and her dad David Up, and she had a brother named Dan. Both of Hannah's parents, both David and Barbara, were pastors or ministers or, something along the lines with the church. And they, for the most part, stayed in Oregon, traveling and preaching at different churches and events. And from my understanding, both of her parents studied what the New Yorker reported as Japanese American churches. And the Up family weren't of the Japanese ethnicity, but they did love the teachings and the things that the Japanese American churches taught, so I guess that's what they studied. Like, Hannah's mom, Barbara, is fluent in Japanese, and I believe that she'd even been a teacher in Japan at one point. But when Hannah was 15 years old, her parents, David and Barbara, split and filed for divorce. Barbara moved to Pennsylvania to live in a Quaker retreat, which is another religious sector. I'm not even close to religious, so I have no idea what the difference is, but Hannah's dad, David, traveled across the world teaching and spreading his religious beliefs after the divorce. David's been to multiple different countries and all over the world teaching his beliefs, since he had gotten a divorce. Hannah's parents were extremely religious, but especially her dad. He believed in a lot of things that are just out of date and don't really reflect an open-minded environment, but to each their own. Like, he believed that people aren't born gay and tons of other things like that, but his beliefs are none of my business, so it's just something that I thought was interesting that I thought I'd mention. But I'm not here to talk about Hannah's parents or their beliefs either. I'm here to talk about Hannah, so let's get back to that. Hannah would often go visit her dad wherever he was living in the world at the time, and she'd usually visit with him like once a year. So this meant that Hannah got to travel to like Fiji, Africa, and all sorts of other exotic places that a broke bitch like me will only ever dream of visiting. Hannah also had plans of following in her mom's footsteps and becoming a teacher, which is exactly what she did. And as far as Hannah's brother Dan goes, his career choice had been to join the Navy. So naturally, this meant that Hannah's brother Dan was often, stationed overseas or in different parts of the world at any given time. Hannah was smart, she was pretty, and literally all of her friends say the same thing. And as cliche as it is, I think that her friends actually meant it when they said that Hannah lit up every room that she walked into. A Zumba teacher that taught Hannah would later say that Hannah was so energetic that everybody in their Zumba class would always joke that they wanted whatever Hannah was on because she was just always so energetic and full of life. She was always so happy and excited for the future. Like, she was literally the life of the party and could turn any situation into something positive. And you can actually see in pictures and videos of Hannah that she just seems like she was so much fun. Like, she seems like somebody that you would meet and then immediately want to be friends with. She looks so much fun, so bubbly, so personable, so easy to get along with, and all of her friends agree that she was literally the best. Hannah attended college in Pennsylvania, where she went on to graduate to become a teacher. Hannah was also super outdoorsy, and she loved to swim. She was an extremely strong swimmer, and she loved to work out. So she's very much the complete opposite of me. Hannah tried to stay on top of her faith while she was in college, but I think she was kind of finding herself and making friends from all different walks of life, which I feel like is a totally normal thing that happens in college. And that it can either be an eye-opening experience as far as seeing new cultures and learning how other people live, or it can just confuse you more about what you believe, and I think we've all been there at some point in our lives. Like, I grew up in a mostly religious house, and as an adult, I'm just not that religious, which is fine. I'm the black sheep. I always have been, I always will be, and I will wear that badge with honor. But I feel like this is kind of where Hannah was in her life at this point. I even think that at one point Hannah had even casually dated a girl in college, which was a major rift between her and her dad. But Hannah's mom seemed to just kind of want to see her daughter happy no matter who she was with, which, I mean, I get this also. I feel like everybody has experimented with something at some point in their lives. And I've always said that if me and my husband ever split up, you can bet your bottom dollar that I'll be with a woman and not a man. But that's just me. Hannah also dated men before and after this one-off relationship with another woman. As friends put it, Hannah lived in Hannah world, which I resonate with. A friend of Hannah's recalled asking Hannah if she thought that she was going to go to hell because of her religious beliefs. And instead of answering the question, Hannah just started bawling because she wasn't sure what to say to her friend, and I kind of think this question made Hannah slowly start to realize how harsh her religion could be. Because she was learning new cultures, new foods, different ways that people lived, and Hannah just loved and accepted everybody for whoever they were. Now, Hannah would kind of plan these yearly trips with her dad wherever he was teaching in the world at around the time that her school schedule would start. She would visit with her dad and then come back right before school was set to start because, like I mentioned, she did end up becoming a teacher just like her mom. Hannah eventually moved to New York City where she'd gotten a job working in the Harlem school system in 2008. And Hannah, who was 23 at the time, had gotten a job at the middle school in Harlem called Thurgood Marshall Academy. And she was excited about her first teaching job and excited about starting the first day of school. But when the first day of school was set to start, Hannah had gotten dressed and left her house for a morning run. But Hannah never showed up for the first day of class, and this was super out of character for Hannah. And as we'll later learn, the month of September and the first day of school starting are two major things that just keep coming back up again and again and again in this case. So once the school realized that Hannah hadn't shown up for the first day of class and she also hadn't called out, she hadn't even let anybody know about a family emergency. So they got Hannah's roommate to see if she was home. And Hannah's roommate was a man named Manuel. And when he started looking around in Hannah's room, he found Hannah's purse along with her wallet and her passport still in her room. But Hannah's cell phone was also in her room still. And all of these things were just kind of laying around in Hannah's room. So Hannah had gotten dressed for this run on the morning that school was set to start, and she dressed in a sports bra and running shorts. She had her hair pulled back in a high ponytail, and after Manuel found Hannah's things, along with Hannah never showing up for the first day of school, Hannah was reported missing. This not showing up for the first day of school was super out of character for Hannah, and her not showing up at a job that she was excited for and a job that she loved doing just wasn't an option for the people that knew Hannah best. Something had to either be seriously wrong or something terrible had happened, and Hannah's missing persons flyers were printed out and passed out to everyone in the area. There were literal thousands of people that were seeing Hannah's face on every street corner every day. Like, everyone in the area of New York knew Hannah's face and knew that she was missing. Hannah had been missing for about 2 weeks, and her family and friends were still putting flyers up everywhere. They had them on the subway, the light poles, on corner store windows, grocery stores, bus stops. Literally the entire area of New York was posted with flyers of Hannah, so everybody was on the lookout. And Hannah's mom, Barbara, had made her way to New York to help expand the search and try to help get the word out. Weeks had gone by, and people were starting to worry that maybe something had happened. Harlem can be dangerous, but big cities like New York are kind of dangerous in general. But thanks to all the missing persons flyers and everybody being on the lookout for Hannah, Hannah's mom, Barbara, had gotten a call one day, and Barbara was asked to come to the NYPD, and the officers investigating Hannah's case needed Barbara to verify if someone actually caught Hannah on a CCTV camera or not. Barbara, of course, rushed to the police station to watch the footage. And the CCTV footage had come from an Apple store, like Apple is an iPhone, because at first I was like, who the hell has a store that only sells apples? This footage shows a woman who looks identical to Hannah walking through the store, and then you can see a man approach the woman who everybody suspects is Hannah. This man had actually gone to college with Hannah or had classes with her at some point somewhere, so this classmate would have definitely known, at least well enough to know if this looked like Hannah or not. And he also would have known that Hannah had been reported missing. And in this footage, you can see this classmate and or acquaintance, whatever, He asked the woman on the CCTV footage if she was Hannah Up, the missing schoolteacher. And the woman on the footage just kind of shakes her head no, and then she shoos the man away before she walks away from this man altogether. But when Hannah's mom, Barbara, saw the CCTV footage, she was absolutely sure, without a shadow of a doubt, that the woman on the footage from the Apple store was Hannah. I found a quote from Hannah's mom, Barbara, that said, quote, "I could see her blow off what he was saying, and I knew instantly it was her. It was all her. She had this characteristic gesture. It's like, oh, no, don't worry about me. You know me. I'm fine." This woman was also caught on CCTV cameras logging into her email account on one of the accessible computers. She only looks at the computer screen for a few seconds before she logs off and leaves the store. But after Hannah's mom, Barbara, saw the footage, she only had one assumption to make. That Hannah knew what she was doing and that she didn't want to be found. Why else would Hannah have told this guy that her name wasn't Hannah and that she wasn't missing, and then log into her email account right afterwards? But nobody could really determine why she wouldn't want to be found. Hannah was excited for the school year to start, and she lived her best life every day. It wouldn't really make sense. What would she be running from? Hannah's friends and family were glad to know that she was alive and seemingly okay and unharmed, at least from what they saw on the footage, but they were confused as to why she wasn't getting in touch with anyone and why she was acting like she wasn't Hannah, especially since Hannah's mom obviously knew that it was Hannah. She would know her daughter, and she would probably be able to pick her daughter out of a crowd, especially now that she's been reported missing. But this sighting at the Apple store wasn't the only sighting that was credible that had came in over the last few days. Hannah had also been seen at a Starbucks in Soho just 2 days after she'd been spotted at the Apple store. When police got the call about Hannah being inside of the Starbucks location in Soho, they immediately went to the Starbucks, but Hannah had seemingly vanished again, with no traces or clues as to where she was now that the police had missed her. Hannah had also been spotted at 5 different sports bars in Midtown, which this actually seems more like a gym type of thing versus a drinking bar. From my research, which is weird as hell, but, that's what I found. I could be wrong, but that's what it seems like to me. Detectives that were working Hannah's case at the time were under the impression that maybe Hannah had been hitting all these different sports bars or gyms to take a shower. Because it seems like if you had a membership, then you were free to use any of the facilities inside the gym. Or maybe the showers were free to everybody. I don't know. I don't go to gyms, so I'm not the chubby bitch that knows about gym etiquette. And then finally, something of substance happened, and it was 20 days after Hannah was reported missing that a ferry boat captain spotted a floating body that looked to be a woman in the ocean. The woman was floating face down, and the captain sent a rescue boat out to go in and, pull the woman off to the boat. The rescue boat took somewhere around 5 to 7 minutes to reach this floating woman. And one of the men later said that they were sure that this woman was dead, but they were able to get her pulled up onto the rescue boat by her feet, and they were able to get her, onto the boat safely. But when the men got this woman lifted up and out of the water, they were shocked when she let out a huge gasp of air and immediately started crying, which I cannot imagine how these men felt. They're pulling what they think is a dead body out of the ocean, but instead she's alive and crying. This woman was taken to a hospital in Staten Island, where it was finally determined that the woman that had been found floating face down in the ocean by the ferry boat captain was actually Hannah Up. Hannah was treated for hypothermia, severe dehydration, and severe sunburn. At the hospital, though, Hannah was able to tell medical staff her name, and she was also able to give medical staff her mom's phone number. And after hospital personnel reached out to Hannah's mom, her friends and family were called to come into the hospital, and the first thing that Hannah asked her mom, Barbara, when she walked into Hannah's hospital room was, quote, "Why am I wet?" Hannah's mom said that Hannah looked like she'd been pulled behind a boat for 3 weeks. Hannah had absolutely no memory of the time that she'd been missing, and she actually had no idea that she'd been missing for the last 20 days. When Hannah's roommate Manuel came to see Hannah in the hospital, she told him that she hoped the hospital would release her soon because she needed to go get her classroom ready for the first day of school. She had absolutely no idea that she'd already missed the first day of school and that she'd missed the first 20 days. The police, of course, show up because this is all super weird, and police were using resources to find Hannah, and they'd been looking for Hannah for 20 days now, and then she just magically appeared and didn't remember anything. So naturally, police are going to investigate and they have some questions. Hannah does try to answer their questions, but she doesn't know the answers to anything that they're asking. Police were curious where Hannah had been sleeping for the last 20 days that she'd been missing. They were also curious about what Hannah had been eating or where she'd been getting her meals from for the last 20 days. They wanted to know where she'd been showering and how she'd been getting around without her Metro card. And even after all of these questions, Hannah tells them that she doesn't know the answers to them. That she's sorry, but she doesn't remember. Which is even weirder than having a legitimate excuse for being MIA for 20 days. She wasn't sure what she'd been eating or where she'd been sleeping or how she'd been getting around or any of the other questions that they'd ask. She just didn't have the answers that they were looking for. The last memory that Hannah had about the day that she'd gone missing was that she had gotten dressed to go for a run before the first day of school at her new teaching job. And that when she'd gotten back from her run, that she would need to wash up and get dressed for the first day of school. But she didn't actually remember anything after leaving her house to go for a run. And of course, Hannah's mom, Barbara, was sleeping at the hospital with Hannah while she was still in the hospital. And according to Barbara, Hannah kind of lifted up in the middle of the night and midway through sleeping and told her mom, Barbara, that she'd been at a lighthouse. But as soon as Hannah said that she'd been at a lighthouse, she laid back down and fell back asleep immediately. And the next morning, when Hannah and her mom Barbara woke up, Barbara asked Hannah what she was talking about the night before about being at a lighthouse. And Hannah had absolutely no memory of ever saying that. Hannah had never had an episode of sleep talking or sleepwalking before, and she was 23. I feel like if this is something that you're going to suffer from, that you'd probably learn about it before you were 23 years old. So she had no memory about where she'd been for the last 20 days, and she had no memory about waking up and saying anything about a lighthouse. Hannah's brother Dan had taken Hannah on a walk to all the piers, the entrances and exits of all the piers, to try to see if anything would jog her memory as far as maybe where she'd entered the water at, and he hoped that maybe this would lead to, what had caused Hannah to forget her entire life for 20 days to start with. But Hannah's brother Dan was obviously, taking leave from work because he was in the military, and he'd only come home to help search for his sister. But once Hannah and her brother got to Pier 40, Hannah did remember a few things that she hadn't remembered before. It wasn't much, but it was something. Hannah told her brother Dan that once they'd gotten onto Pier 40, that she remembered a full moon and some lights that looked like they had been floating on top of the water. And after checking, it had been a full moon during the time that Hannah had been missing, and there was actually a lighthouse nearby where Hannah had been found, which would explain the lights that Hannah said that she'd seen that looked like they had been floating on the water. So Hannah's brother Dan had also been meeting and talking with the captain of the Staten Island ferry, who had been the one that had originally spotted and rescued Hannah. The two talked about the currents and the winds and how Hannah ended up where she was eventually found. And during this time, Hannah's brother Dan had spent talking with the captain of the Staten Island ferry. They were able to deduce that there had also been a floating lantern, a Japanese floating lantern ceremony, on one of the nearby piers to honor the victims of 9/11. And, that had happened during the time that Hannah had gone missing. And then after talking to her brother and her mom, they remembered that Hannah, when she was a kid, she had danced in an annual festival which also had a floating lantern ceremony, and the lights of the ceremony that Hannah had danced to as a kid represented the souls of the departed. So Hannah's mom, Barbara, thought that this must have been something that stuck with Hannah throughout her, into adulthood, and that maybe this was what she was remembering and thinking of. There was also the possibility that Hannah had been roaming the beaches through the day, which is why she would have been so sunburned, and then sleeping in the water at night. I don't know how she didn't drown, but when Dan and the captain of the Staten Island ferry were trying to figure out where Hannah had gotten into the water and, how she'd ended up where she was eventually found, the two men had come up with Hannah had likely gotten into the water somewhere close by the lower Manhattan area before the tide had gotten super strong and carried her more south. Luckily, though, she'd floated far enough south to be spotted by the ferry boat. But how wild is it that Hannah was found floating face down in a massive-ass body of water where she should have and could have so easily drowned? But that she was spotted and then rescued, even though the rescue boat took about 7 minutes to make it to her. She was still alive and she still hadn't drowned. That is completely unheard of for me at least. Because I live right outside of Myrtle Beach, and we hear and see people that have been reported as drowning all of the time. Even when the waters and the currents are fine, much less when they're strong and rougher than usual. So Hannah's case was literally a miracle at best in my book. So obviously after finding Hannah alive and unharmed for the most part, and then them realizing that she didn't remember shit about the entire 20 days that she'd been missing, the police and Hannah's family wanted to run some psychiatric tests where they performed multiple brain scans and multiple CAT scans. But all the scans that they did, nothing was ever found out of the normal. Even experts couldn't think of one thing that may have caused Hannah to forget her entire life for 20 whole ass days. So after they'd run every kind of test and scan that they could think of, Hannah was eventually diagnosed with dissociative fugue, which is an extremely rare condition, but people who suffer from dissociative fugue often lose access to their autobiographical memories, like personal details, almost every part of their lives. They lose all of their personal identity, like their name, their address, family members, like they don't even know who they are. And dissociative fugue may sound familiar because that's what Jason Bourne from the movies supposedly suffers from too, I think. Which this would explain why Hannah had someone that she should have actually known or at least recognized ask if she was Hannah, and she'd tell him no. And I'm sure you're wondering how Hannah would have been able to do something like log into her email account at the Apple Store if she didn't remember who she was. And basically the only thing that doctors could come up with was that Hannah would have been doing whatever was part of her daily routine. So possibly something similar to muscle memory, like anytime Hannah got in front of a computer, that she would automatically think to check, log in and check her email. Like being inside of a Starbucks, it's almost like that was something that was done strictly for muscle memory too. As if stopping at Starbucks was part of her daily routine, and it wouldn't have been something that she would have had to have really thought about doing. It would have been something more along the lines of something that she did often, probably likely daily. So when the guy at the Apple Store had asked if she was the missing teacher, Hannah, and she said no, that was because she honestly didn't know or recognize that she was Hannah. And going to the gym that Hannah often went to, she would have known by muscle memory that she could take a shower there, and as far as eating goes, I'm not sure if she was dumpster diving for food or water or what she was doing, because even after Hannah was found safe and sound, she still wasn't able to answer any of those types of questions. She still couldn't tell anyone where she'd gotten food from or water from or, where and how she'd been working out and, things like that. Hannah honestly didn't know what the answers to any of those questions were, so, she couldn't answer them even if she wanted to. Which this had to be scary as hell for not only Hannah, but her family and friends, because Hannah wasn't the type to lie. She was super dependable and extremely reliable. So this was just so out of character for her, especially for the people that knew her best. A dissociative fugue state can be brought on by either childhood trauma or life trauma in general that you haven't dealt with, like sexual assault, physical assault, things like that. But they can also be brought on by any kind of major stressors. And even though no one knew of any past or present trauma that Hannah had gone through, a dissociative fugue state could be brought on by, natural disasters like a hurricane, tornado, a snowstorm, a flood, etc., where you would feel like you don't really have control over your life. So it could have been literally a number of different things that could have brought this on for Hannah. It could have been the school year being about to start. It could have been finances. It could have been being put in an odd situation. It could be 100 different things. But neither of Hannah's parents could think of anything that would have made or been the cause of Hannah going into a dissociative fugue state either. She hadn't had any childhood trauma stressors that would normally be associated with dissociative fugue, so no one could really figure out why or how this happened to Hannah. And as we all know, some people handle stress differently than others. Some people cope fine and they never have a problem and they never lose their shit, and then other people can have a small or seemingly meaningless kind of trivial thing happen, and if it's never dealt with, it becomes explosive. So even just that could lead someone into a dissociative fugue state. Dissociative fugue has been described as a kind of self-exile, but it is known that people who suffer from dissociative fugue states are known to wander aimlessly with no real place or destination in mind. And a lot of the times, people have a really hard time accepting things that they don't understand or things that they can't explain. So once Hannah returned home safely and relatively unharmed, she started getting really nasty messages, texts, and emails from people that she didn't even know, saying how they couldn't believe that she would make an entire city or state worry about her when she had been completely fine the whole time. They were saying things about how she had wasted police resources and police's time. And like I said, people often don't understand what they can't explain, and they don't like to accept that. And this is kind of hard to explain. But on top of not understanding what a dissociative fugue state is, people also don't like to let go of the control that they think that they have so easily. So for people to accept that they don't actually have control of their minds, that's not going to be something that a lot of people would just accept easily. So there isn't like a medicine that you can take for this. There isn't really anything that you can do to like stop or prevent a fugue state from happening. But regardless of what everybody else thought, Hannah's friends and family were just glad to have Hannah back home, safe and sound. And Hannah had gotten so tired of the press and the publicity that had come along with her missing persons case that she'd even thought about changing her name. It was that bad. But Hannah eventually decided against changing her name. She kind of accepted that this was part of her story and that she wasn't going to be sorry or ashamed of it. So she stayed with the same name that she'd always had. And Hannah's diagnosis didn't come easily because she was seen and examined and vetted by multiple different medical professionals before her diagnosis was made final. But dissociative fugue was really the only thing that made sense for all of the symptoms and the way that everything kind of played out in the end. And Hannah never did regain those memories that she lost while she'd been missing for those 20 days. So it's not like it was able to be explained later on, because it never was. Hannah had actually gone so far as to be put under hypnosis to try to remember any of the events that may have caused her dissociative fugue in the first place. Whether it would have been something from her childhood or something that had happened on the day that Hannah left her house when she had planned to go on a run and then, go to school. But even after Hannah was put under hypnosis, nothing was found that could have caused her dissociative fugue state at all. They couldn't pull anything from Hannah's past or present to explain why she'd gone into this dissociative fugue state to begin with. And then in 2012, Hannah found an excuse to leave New York. She'd gotten a job in Maryland at a Montessori school. And I had to look a little bit more into this because I'm a country bumpkin and we don't have those anywhere near us or anywhere that I've ever heard of for that matter. So basically, a Montessori school is a type of schooling where they believe that every kid is born differently and they focus on what that kid succeeds in versus what they're good at. So these types of schools try to cater to whatever the kid is best at and whatever the kid shows the most interest in. So they don't learn the same curriculum as public schools or even private schools, which is pretty damn cool. I kind of wish we did have one near us, because I'd definitely sign my boys up. It was 4 years after Hannah had first gone missing that she would go missing again in 2012, but this time in Maryland. And again in 2012, Hannah would go missing on the day that school was set to start. So again on the first day of school and again in September. And Hannah's family and friends were alerted that she'd never shown up for the first day of teaching. And again, just like the first time, Hannah hadn't called out with any medical or family emergencies. She just hadn't shown up. And just like the time before, Hannah's purse, wallet, and phone were found close by in the neighborhood that she lived in. And then Hannah's mom, Barbara, got a call from an unknown number. And when she answered it, it was Hannah. But Hannah had only gone missing without a trace for 2 days this time. Hannah herself had actually woken up and found that she was floating about a mile or so from the school that she was supposed to be teaching at in a creek. Hannah had woken up to a shopping cart or grocery buggy that was kind of close by to where she had woken up at. And we call them buggies in the South. I'm pretty sure everybody else calls them shopping carts. So I guess we'll go with shopping carts. But Hannah didn't know why this shopping cart was near her or if maybe it was hers. She had no idea. But this time was a little different because when Hannah had woken up in the creek water, she immediately knew who she was and what she should do. She actually walked to like a public place nearby and asked to borrow a stranger's phone where she called her mom from. And the last time that this had happened, Hannah had seemed super confused and shit when she was found alive. And this time it was like she'd just woken up from a nap or something. This would be the second dissociative fugue state that Hannah had gone into so far. She had gone into the one 4 years earlier in New York and then again in Maryland. And Hannah didn't seem to realize that any time had passed, again, just like she hadn't the first time. Was like she should just go home and get dressed for the first day of teaching without realizing she'd already missed the first 2 days of school. But both times Hannah had gone missing and been found, she'd been found in a body of water. And just like the time before, Hannah didn't remember a single thing that had happened during the 2 days that she had been missing for. She was still so clueless as to what happened, and even though medical professionals had all agreed that the first time that Hannah had gone missing and went into a dissociative fugue state, that Hannah would likely never experience another one in her life. They had all really kind of agreed that it was just like a one-off dissociative fugue state. But it wasn't. This was her second one in the last 3 or 4 years. And Hannah's friends and family all noted that the same things had happened again right before her dissociative fugue state was brought on. She had been getting ready to start the first day of school, and then she had been found in a body of water. Hannah's mom and family had even kind of talked about having some sort of tracking ankle monitor put on Hannah. That way, in the event that she did go into a third dissociative fugue state, that they'd be able to easily track and find her. And Hannah thought about it, but she eventually decided that the tracking ankle monitor was something she didn't want to do. Hannah's family had said that even though this would have come in handy to be able to track and find Hannah if something else happened, that Hannah was a grown woman and that she decided against it and there wasn't really anything else they could do or say about it, which is true. If I'm not mistaken, Maryland PD had actually offered to put like a home arrest ankle monitor on Hannah, just without the restrictions. That way, if something happened, they could easily pull it up, locate her, find her, and, there wouldn't be a big search party and resources wasted. But nobody would be able to force Hannah into wearing this ankle monitor like a common criminal because she has a rare condition. That would be like forcing somebody with depression or anxiety to wear an ankle monitor so they didn't commit suicide, and that's just not how that works. So Hannah never did get the ankle monitor for tracking. And Hannah decided she wasn't going to let this affect her life. It was part of her life, but it didn't have to, she didn't have to revolve her life around it. So during the time that Hannah had taught at the Montessori school in Maryland, she had completely fallen in love with the history of Montessori schools and the ways of their teachings, and she was super into it. It kind of seemed like Hannah had finally found her calling in life, and she'd finally found what she'd love to do, and she was good at it. And she decided she wasn't going to let her dissociative fugue hold her back whatsoever. So when Hannah got a job offer to teach in the U.S. Virgin Islands at a different Montessori school, she completely jumped at the chance. Hannah had even joked telling friends that she was moving to paradise. This would be the perfect place to start fresh. Nobody would know her there, and nobody would know about the past 2 times that Hannah had gone missing. So Hannah eventually moved to St. Thomas in the U.S. Virgin Islands, and she took to the island like she'd lived there her whole life. The locals loved Hannah, and she just fit in so easily there. Hannah had made lots of new friends since she'd moved to St. Thomas, and she loved living on this island. Hannah would swim in the ocean, she loved to snorkel, she loved to run along the beaches, and she attended all the festivals and island activities. And naturally, she's living on an island, so it gets to a point where you eventually come pretty familiar with everybody who lives on the island. And for the first 4 years that Hannah worked and lived in St. Thomas, she had been thriving. She loved it. Hannah taught at the new school in St. Thomas, and the first year that she was there, she absolutely loved it. Hannah was so good at her job that when parents would come in for a tour of the school to see if it was a good fit for their family or not, they were taken to Hannah's classroom. She was the teacher that the school wanted to show off. She was the teacher that the school wanted potential parents to see. The school had even paid for Hannah to be fully licensed and certified to be a standalone teacher at the Montessori school. Because she had originally been hired and offered the job as a teaching assistant, and after the first year, they wanted her to have her own classroom. The new school year was about to start, and Hannah was pumped. She was excited to meet her new kids and set up her classroom. But Mother Nature had other plans. A natural disaster was about to ruin the beautiful clear waters and the white sand beaches that Hannah had fallen so in love with. It was September 6, 2017, when Hurricane Irma made landfall in the U.S. Virgin Islands. Most locals had started evacuating the island beforehand because it was expected to be bad. Hurricane Irma came swooping through and making landfall in the U.S. Virgin Islands as a Category 5 hurricane. Cruise ships and ferry boats were used as mercy boats to help transport anyone who chose to evacuate the islands from the hurricane. And even though all of Hannah's friends and even her boyfriend were evacuating the island, Hannah said that her heart was in St. Thomas and that she wasn't leaving. And once everyone who decided to leave had been evacuated, Hurricane Irma completely demolished the U.S. Virgin Islands. People had lost their homes, they were without power for weeks at a time, food and resources were scarce, and the usually colorful and lively islands had trees toppled over and houses and vehicles scattered about and ruined. And I live on the coast of South Carolina, and we get the ass end of just about every major hurricane that hits, and they usually only come in at a Category 2 or 3, and as bad as we get it, I absolutely could not imagine being somewhere being hit by a Category 5 hurricane. Like, we have an entire hurricane ready kit. And every time a hurricane's coming through, we go through the motions of strapping everything down and boarding up windows, making sure the generator's working and that we have enough gas and groceries to make it at least a week without power. And, when we got hit with Hurricane Matthew, we were out of power for over 2 weeks. And I'm here to tell you, 2 weeks without being able to shower and cook was absolute torture. So I definitely sympathize with the situation. The small brunt of the end of the hurricanes that we get are like regular thunderstorms compared to what the U.S. Virgin Islands got in 2017. Because it completely devastated the islands and the people that live there. Through the rain and the 185-mile-per-hour winds, Hannah and her roommate stayed huddled up in the laundry room of their apartment through the hurricane. And Hannah had kept in touch with her mom and her friends back home through text messages, updating them on things that were happening and letting them know, that her and her roommates were okay and what they were experiencing. The day after Hurricane Irma hit, Hannah went to the school where she worked to help try to clean up and prep for yet another hurricane. Because even though St. Thomas had just experienced the Category 5 hurricane, Hurricane Irma, just the day before this, Hurricane Maria was on its way and headed straight for the islands. When Hannah got home from helping clean the school up and trying to get it ready to withstand another hurricane, she learned that her roommates weren't sticking around for round 2 with Mother Nature and they were leaving for Hurricane Maria. Hannah's roommates asked if she was going to evacuate with them, and Hannah told them that she was going to stay and try to do whatever she could to try to help get the school back open after the second hurricane hit the islands. She said that the quicker they could get the school open, the quicker the kids could return back to like a normal routine. So she was going to stay and wait it out and try to help get the damage from the second hurricane cleaned up so that the school year would hopefully be able to start and not be as delayed. Hannah told her roommates that she was going to go back to the school on September 13th to help finish up and get things ready for, another Category 5 hurricane. Hannah had actually left a note for her roommate on the morning of September 13th saying that she was going for a swim and then heading back into school. But everyone at the school on September 13th were there helping to fix and clean things up after the hurricane, and Hannah never showed up to the school to help prep for Hurricane Maria, which was weird now in hindsight, but helping to keep the school on track for a hurricane wasn't something that was mandatory. It was just like a all hands on deck type of thing, like if someone could help and they were willing, then great, but if they couldn't make it or if they had evacuated, that was okay too. So it's not really like her showing up would have set off any red flags or anything. But the next day on September 14th, the school was holding like a staff meeting for all the teachers that taught at the school. But Hannah was a no-show for this meeting too, and this did set off alarm bells. Hannah wouldn't just skip a staff meeting, and she hadn't been one of those teachers that had decided to evacuate, so she should have been there. And once Hannah's roommate, Maggie, found out that Hannah hadn't shown up for the teachers' meeting, she started calling all of Hannah's friends and family back in the States and asking if anybody had talked to Hannah since the day before. When her roommate was talking to friends and family members, she said it looked like Hannah had just gotten in her car and never came back home. When Hannah's roommate finally got in touch with a few family members and friends, Hannah's roommate Maggie was told to look by the water. Now, Maggie had no idea what that even meant because Hannah had only mentioned her dissociative fugue to a very, very, very select few people in St. Thomas. And Maggie, along with most of her other friends in St. Thomas, had no idea that this was something that Hannah had suffered from, and they definitely didn't know that she'd already gone missing twice before this. So with this new information about Hannah's dissociative fugue disorder and this new information about checking by the water, Her friends immediately headed to Hannah's favorite beach, Sapphire Beach. Hannah would go swimming in Sapphire Beach almost every day, and she loved to run along the shore. Like, Sapphire Beach was probably Hannah's favorite place on the entire island. And when Hannah's friends got to Sapphire Beach, they discovered that Hannah's car was parked close by. And as they walked around and they're looking for Hannah, there's no sign that she'd been there. So her friends go into a bar that's right next to the shore to ask if they'd, recently seen Hannah. But once they got to the bar, they saw that Hannah's car keys, her sandals, and her sarong that she'd been wearing were all stacked neatly on a bar stool inside. Hannah's friends asked the bartender why all of Hannah's things were sitting inside on this stool inside the bar. And the bartender told them that he'd come onto the beach that day to try to help clear up some of the things from the hurricane. And he said that he'd found all of Hannah's things strung out on the beach, and that he'd just kind of stuck them all inside and put them in a pile, thinking maybe somebody would come back looking for them. The bartender said that they hadn't seen Hannah, and Hannah's friends found that she wasn't inside the bar either. No one had seen Hannah since the morning that she told her roommate Maggie that she was going to help get the school ready for Hurricane Maria. Hannah hadn't been seen since. Locals and friends of Hannah's, who had all just gone through this massive hurricane together, were all still out trying to help search for Hannah, even though there was another Category 5 hurricane coming right behind the first one. Hurricane Maria was set to hit St. Thomas, where Hannah lived, within just a few days of Hurricane Irma that had just come through and wrecked the entire island. And Hannah's family was made aware that she was missing yet again, and they had already been kind of worried about Hannah just because she was living in and not evacuating the area right in the bullseye of two major Category 5 hurricanes that were supposed to hit within days of each other, but now no one could find her, so that's just something else for her family to worry about. And after a couple of days of searching, people had to get back home and try to bunker down and get ready for the next hurricane to hit. They did search extensively for Hannah until they didn't have any other options, aside from endangering themselves or going home to return to safety. And they'd planned to return searching after Hurricane Maria hit and had passed. So after the first few days of searching for Hannah, people had no choice but to go home and keep themselves and their families safe. After everyone on the island learned that Hannah was missing, one of Hannah's co-workers, who Hannah had gone to help, get the school ready for the second hurricane, this co-worker later said that she didn't really think much of it at the time, but that Hannah had been acting a little off when the two were trying to get the school ready for Hurricane Maria. This coworker remembered that Hannah just kind of answered every question with a yes or a no, and that wasn't like her at all. But all of this was said in hindsight, and after they'd learned that Hannah suffered from dissociative fugue state, and after Hannah had already been reported missing. She hadn't really thought much of it until after Hannah had already gone missing, and after they'd learned about the fugue states that Hannah had suffered from in New York and Maryland. People started wondering if maybe Hannah had gone into a dissociative fugue state and then gotten onto one of the cruise ships or ferry boats that were out in the ocean moving people who wanted to evacuate the island to safety. Especially since the people that were loading up on the cruise ships and ferries were supposed to have a form of ID so that they could keep track of who they were transporting and whatnot. But with the hurricane coming, they really weren't as strict with it. And, there was easily people that were on those boats that had no form of ID. They hadn't kept as detailed a records as what they normally would have, so people kind of speculated about the fact that maybe Hannah had changed her mind and that she did end up getting on one of the boats in the first stages of a dissociative fugue state. The boat would have been in the water after all, and her dissociative fugue states have always revolved around being in the school year, or the beginning of the school year, and in some kind of body of water. Hannah's family and friends set up a Facebook page to try to spread the word about the disappearance, called Find Hannah Up. And a post was made on September 19th, 2007, just days after Hannah had been reported missing, and it said, quote, "Hannah Up has been missing since Thursday morning, September 14th, in St. Thomas, United States Virgin Islands. Her car has been found at Sapphire Beach Bar with her cell phone in it, and her keys were found near the beach." And this third and final time that Hannah had gone missing was in 2017, so she most definitely would have had her cell phone, and she probably always had her cell phone on her person. By 2017, everybody was completely glued to their phones, and it was just the normal thing to do. Something else to keep in mind about this time that Hannah had gone missing is that even though Hannah was a super strong swimmer and she was incredibly active, And even though Hannah had swam in the ocean nearly every single day since she'd moved to St. Thomas, the waters and the currents of the winds would have been incredibly strong and unpredictable both before and after these hurricanes. And even if Hannah had gotten into the water and tried to swim to a smaller key off the main island, she still likely wouldn't have been able to fight the currents and the winds. But after Hurricane Maria tore through St. Thomas, friends and locals were right back out searching. Everyone was searching on foot and along the shorelines. People were out in their boats looking in the water for Hannah, and they'd even been searching the surrounding islands that were around St. Thomas. Hannah's family was pretty hopeful that Hannah hadn't gone far because both other times that she'd gone missing before, she had shown up on CCTV cameras pretty close by to where she'd gone missing from. The Coast Guard had even brought in a few helicopters at one point. That way they could search overhead and have an aerial view, in the search for Hannah. And Hannah's mom, Barbara, was absolutely distraught by Hannah's disappearance. And she was sure that if she could just get to St. Thomas, that she'd be able to find her daughter. With the hurricanes hitting, travel wasn't exactly, it wasn't exactly like normal day-to-day things going on in the U.S. Virgin Islands. Barbara believed that Hannah either had to be close by the island or on the island somewhere. Maybe Hannah didn't know who she was again, and Barbara was mortified when she learned that it may be weeks before she could get from where she lived to St. Thomas to help look for Hannah. But Barbara was eventually able to catch a flight to make it to St. Thomas to try to help search for Hannah. Barbara even started getting into Hannah's car and driving aimlessly around the island of St. Thomas. Barbara said that driving Hannah's car and seeing the same things on the island that Hannah had fallen in love with made Barbara feel like she was closer to Hannah just by being there on the island. Barbara would also go to all of Hannah's favorite hangout spots, and this made her feel closer to Hannah in some way too. Barbara even moved from her own home where she'd been living to St. Thomas for over a year to be able to, have any free chance she got to look for Hannah. Barbara told the TV station A&E during an interview for a show titled Vanished in Paradise, quote, "There are moments where she seems so close that I think she's around any corner." And there are a few other similarities to the first two times that Hannah went missing that I haven't mentioned yet. When she'd gone missing the very first time in New York, Hannah had kind of stayed to herself and inside of her apartment where she hadn't really talked to anyone in days before she eventually disappeared. And in St. Thomas, Hannah's phone hadn't been used in at least a whole full day before she was reported missing. But there were a few other things that had happened right before Hannah would go into a fugue state that she oftentimes didn't remember. Like once, right before she'd gone missing, the first time in New York, she hadn't remembered where she had been or what she had done the past few days before she had been reported missing. And later, when Hannah was found, she'd gone through her bank statements to find that she'd paid for her way into a movie theater, but she had no idea what the movie was about and had no memory of ever watching it or even being at the theater that day. So this may explain why Hannah had been so short with her coworker the day before she'd gone missing. She may have been in like a trance before the fugue state was in like full effect. And then there's the possibility that Hannah may have tried to swim off of the island of St. Thomas and that maybe she'd tried to swim to another key close by. But the winds and the rain, with as bad as they were, she would have never made it. Even if she'd been in a dissociative fugue state when she tried to swim across the island to another key, she likely had no idea why she was swimming, and she likely didn't realize the danger that she'd be putting herself in. Just like the time that she'd been found floating face down in the Hudson River by a ferry captain. Hannah wouldn't realize that she was at risk of drowning either. A friend of Hannah said that Hannah found life underwater so fascinating and that the water was her happy place. And since all of the medical professionals that had looked deeper into dissociative fugue say that it's triggered by either some kind of sexual or physical trauma or some kind of like life-altering sudden change, they also say it can be brought on by a sudden urge in stressful situations and natural disasters, hence a hurricane. But Hannah was also teaching kids who didn't have enough food to eat and kids who didn't have good, stable home lives. So this could have also been a possible stressor for the first day of school starting back. So if she had gone into a dissociative fugue state, then it would make perfect sense that she was always found near the water. That was where she'd felt most at peace and most at ease. But Hannah had lived on St. Thomas for 3 years at the time that she went missing, and she'd gotten herself ready for the first day of school quite a few times while she'd been living on St. Thomas. So maybe the stress of 2 Category 5 hurricanes on top of trying to make sure everything was set, safe, and ready for the first day of school, that may have been enough to push Hannah into a dissociative fugue state. But I don't know, I'm not a doctor, I'm just speculating. And then, of course, there are multiple theories out there about Hannah faking her own death and starting a new life somewhere else. And, there's so many theories out there that I'm not even going to include them in this episode. There are also people who say that dissociative fugue isn't a real thing and that it's a made-up condition. And I'm guessing those are probably the same people that say the earth is flat. So we'll leave those people out of the episode too. The point is that everybody needs to be on the lookout for Hannah because she could quite literally be anywhere. If she would have gotten onto one of those mercy boats that were there to help people evacuate, and if she did that while she was in a fugue state, she could have been dropped off at a number of different places along the way. The possibilities really are endless in this case because there's so much that's not known and not understood about dissociative fugue. And then again, Hannah could very well just be aimlessly wandering around right now, not having any idea that anybody's looking for her. At the time that Hannah went missing, she was 34 years old with light brown hair and brown eyes. She was about 5'7" tall, and the last time that she was seen was September 14th, 2017 in the U.S. Virgin Islands in St. Thomas. Hannah also had a tattoo of a triangle with a wave inside of her right ankle and another tattoo of a sunflower on her right thigh. She had a third tattoo that was a Venus symbol, but in Hannah's tattoo of the symbol of the planet Venus, it has an extra line. And with these distinct tattoos in mind, there was a sighting where someone reported that they'd seen Hannah in Puerto Rico. The woman seen in Puerto Rico had the tattoo of the triangle with the wave inside of it that Hannah had. But that lead was looked into and nothing ever came of it. There was another sighting where 2 employees claimed that they'd seen Hannah at an empty house where homeless people would often stay in St. Thomas. And once police and Hannah's mom Barbara arrived at the house where Hannah was supposedly spotted at, there was nothing related to Hannah's case found, even though there had been a woman that looked a lot like Hannah put in handcuffs. But when Barbara got upstairs to identify the woman, she realized that it wasn't Hannah, and luckily this lady that the police had handcuffed was super friendly and cooperative, and she really sympathized with Hannah's mom, Barbara. Things got even more quiet from here as far as leads go in Hannah's case, and eventually years go by with no credible sightings and no credible leads to the whereabouts of Hannah. Any and everywhere that they were searching was just turning up empty leads, and things eventually died down. Hannah still hasn't been found as of right now in April 2023. Hannah's family wholeheartedly believes that she's still alive, and even though no one had actually seen Hannah go into the water, everyone just kind of assumed that Hannah had gotten into the ocean and either got carried away or that she'd got on one of the boats that were transporting people to evacuate. But either way, not one confirmed sighting of Hannah Up has been made since September 14th, 2017. This year, in September 2023, will mark the 6th year that Hannah has been gone, and anyone with information is urged to stay with Hannah until authorities arrive, because again, she may not even realize who she is and that people are out looking for her. People with information or leads about Hannah Up or her whereabouts are asked to call 724-591-0675. And that is the case of Hannah Up. That was a crazy week of research, y'all. I am amazed at what the mind can do that we have no control over. So I guess this is the part where I tell you to rate and review the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcast, Audible, wherever you listen. This is also the point in the episode where I tell you to go follow me on Facebook at Mama Murdered a Podcast and on Twitter and Instagram at murdered_mama. And that's all I have for you this week. So let's do it again. Same time, same place, next Wednesday. See you then.
That's how my mama murdered a podcast.